So today what I wanted to go over was Project Online, and one of the changes that was made recently to help accommodate the 30,000 projects in PWA. And this capability was basically to allow you to have your project sites in a different site collection than PWA, so you can sort of spread them around. And things I'll be covering today is looking at those new settings, a quick demonstration of how they work, I talk about the limitations that are in place when you are using those settings. Look at some potential workarounds, particularly around permissions, which I found as sort of an interesting way of doing it. I picked up from one of our MVPs. So the new settings are set per EPT. So we moved the setting from the connected SharePoint sites sort of heading and put it down into each EPT. So if you're in project permissions mode, and that is one of the limitations, you can go in here and for each of your EPTs you can say whether sites get created automatically, whether the user is allowed to choose, and also where the site creation location is. So in this case, that's my Bryce Smith PJO site, and I've got an extra site collection called PWA sites. So rather than putting them in my PWA, I'm putting them into the PWA sites if I've got a particular setting configured. So I'll jump over and quickly show you how that all works by sharing my desktop. So if I'm in Chrome, then that means I'm in my Bryce Smith PJO site. So this is where I'll be showing you some of the stuff with the settings. I'll be jumping into Flow a little bit later on to show you some stuff as well. And I'll also jump into the Admin Center. So if I'm looking at my SharePoint Admin Center, for example, be able to see here that I've got my normal PWA site, which is the one I'm going to be demonstrating with today, but I've also got my PWA sites site. So that's my PWA space site. This is my PWA sites space site, where I'm going to put my PWA sites. I've also got a SharePoint permission site that I'll jump into as well, just to show you the differences that you see there. So over to my PWA, and if I jump into my PWA settings and my enterprise project types, scroll down, I've got this EPT called external sites. And if I open that up and scroll down, this is where I configure my site creation stuff. So I'm going to say I'm going to allow users to choose, so it won't automatically create a site. In my demo, I'll go in and create one via the connected SharePoint sites, but I mean, you may or may not have this set to create your next publish, whatever. I just chose to have it set like this. Obviously, in PWA, it doesn't really prompt you if you create a project, so allowing users to choose really means you make them go to connected SharePoint sites. If they're creating a project from Project Pro, then it does come up with the dialog and allows you to really choose. And the site creation location here, I'm putting these in my PWA site. I think it does actually validate this as well. I think while I was entering this, I was still creating my PWA sites, and at first it didn't allow me to put it in. Another couple of things that you'll notice on here, which I'll come back to in terms of the limitations: only project sites created inside of the project web app site will synchronize user permissions, and only project sites created inside of the project web app site will synchronize tasks. So even though you can configure this here, you can actually check those boxes, but they won't actually do anything because you're outside. So I don't know why they didn't sort of check if you'd done something here and then change this. I suppose you could put a location in there that was actually in your PWA. I don't know if you could put a sub-site in there. Anyway, that's an example that
currently for your PWA site, that is not a project web app. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. Yeah. That in effect, if I go to SharePoint and go over to my PWA sites and actually go into here, you'll see that it's just a site. It's not a PWA site. It's just a site, and it has already, if I go to site contents and subsites, you can see I've already got some sites here that I've created. Okay, so that's how things are configured. Let's close one of those down. This is my external sites. So I'm actually going to create a project now and sort of show you how this works. So if I go to projects, new and then go down to my external sites project, I can put in here plan 1. I haven't got any required fields, but I've got a few. Somebody's been testing on my server, so I've got lots of weird custom fields in here, but I don't need to do anything with them. Just click finish. It's going to create my project. It should be pretty quick because it's not doing anything. There's no template, there's no site template. It's not creating the site at this point, so that everything goes through pretty swiftly. I'm actually going to go in and build a team here because I'm going to be using these people later. So I'm going to choose me and Ake, and let's have Garth, Sarah Davis, Katie Jordan, the usual suspects. So I'm going to add those to my team, and I'm going to save and close. And now I'm going to publish my project. Now at this point I haven't got a site created for this particular project. Nothing would happen at this point with the site anyway. But I'm going to jump over to the connected SharePoint sites and look for the site look for the project that I just created. What did I call it? Triage Plan 1. So it's down the bottom there. So I've got no site, so I'm going to go and create the site for that one, and we'll see where it gets created. And it's already showing me really where it's going to get created. It's going to be in the PWA sites one. It's going to be called Triage Plan 1, and say OK to that. And that shouldn't take too long to create that site. I think that's probably happened by now. So there it is. So if we go into my PWA sites for Triage Plan 1, we can see it's a project site. We've got the deliverables, risks, issues. If we go into the site settings, site permissions, we'll see that it's just really a SharePoint site. It doesn't have any of the normal permissions that we might see on a project site if it was in PWA, because it would have added the other groups and all that kind of stuff. So we've just got the standard members, owners and visitors groups in there, and we've got nobody obviously in any of these because I've not really done anything with them. I'm probably going to move on with the demo now. I was going to come back to this after the next slide, but I don't think the next slide really adds much and just takes me back and forth. So I'm going to come from here back to my PWA and probably jump back into my project. So here I am back in Triage Plan 1, and I'm going to publish it again. Now, as I said, one of the limitations is we don't synchronize the users, but I have added some code behind this, and I'll show you exactly where that happened in a short while. And if we now go over to our connected SharePoint sites and our site and look at our site settings, site permissions, with a bit of luck, if it's already happened, I should see, and I don't. It hasn't fired yet, possibly. Anyway, I'll take you to where I had planned that this should happen. And I planned I can have a look in Planner and see whether it's actually triggered in there yet. Because I have a list of published projects here. And I can see here that my Triage Plan 1 has actually put an entry into Planner. So basically I've got a flow set up. This isn't really doing anything. This is just sort of an indicator that something happened, so I was really using it for sort of debugging. So the first stage was it puts a plan in here. What it then does, it goes off and calls an Azure function, and that function then looks at the plan, see who the members are, and then add those members to the site. I'm just going to see whether they've appeared yet before I go and look. Yep, there we go. So we've got Ake, me, Garth Fort, Katie Jordan and Sarah Davis. So it did take a few seconds for that to come through. So I'll take you into the code now and sort of show you how that happens. And it's all based on this second flow here. When a project is published and the condition is create a task. And I added it so that it basically goes from project. When a project is published, it pushes some stuff into Planner. And as a next step, it makes an HTTP request to a particular Azure function. So if I go and edit that flow, I can show you exactly what it's doing. So the first thing is when a project is published, it's looking at the project type. And I'm not really making use of this. I was hoping it was be more useful than this. I read project type and my brain read enterprise project type. So I was thinking, oh, that's cool because I can just use a condition of when it's a particular enterprise project type, I can then go off and do other stuff. Unfortunately, it wasn't as flexible as that. When I actually looked to see what values were coming through, the value was 0. So I think it is really the project type. So project type 0 is a standard ordinary project. So I still kept the condition in there. I might sort of come and use that for something else later on. And basically what it does is if it's a type 0, then it does this create a task in planner and then goes off to do the HTTP stuff. If it isn't 0, it creates a task in planner anyway, but it doesn't do the HTTP stuff, assuming that you wouldn't want to do it if the type was a template or whatever. Not that you can publish templates, but I guess master and sub projects and various other things that have types of not 0. So the create task is fairly straightforward. So all I'm doing is looking at a particular plan ID, in this case published projects, and I'm giving it a title of the project name, the project type, and the project ID. So that's what we were seeing here, where we've got the project name, project type, project ID. And I'm putting it in the bucket to do. And I could, if I wanted to, put start times and date times. I did try putting a date in here from the dynamic created date, but it didn't actually recognize it as the right format as a date string. So I probably have to use some expression to turn that date into the format of date that Flow is expecting here, but it didn't really matter for what I was doing. So that's sort of the first part of it. The second part, which is where the interesting stuff happens, is that I'm making an HTTP post request off to this particular function in Azure, and it's calling a function HTTP trigger set PWA site perms, and I give it a code there so it knows that it's got the right permissions to hit this particular post method, and I pass in the project ID. So all I'm doing here is saying, okay, run this function and give it this parameter. So that's the flow side of the house, and the flow side of the house just really goes off and does it. And it will get a response from that, and we can actually see, I think, if I go, so I want to leave that page, if we actually dig into the flows that have already happened, right, okay, so we get back into this. If I look at ones that have already happened, so this one was 26 seconds ago, I can see that the expression was true, it then went down this path, it created the plan, and there's all the sort of debug information there, and then it made the HTTP request, and it got a success code of 200. So now I'm going over to the function itself, and if I jump into Azure and look for this Bryce Smith function, and functions are what they are now calling sort of serverless computing. So if I wanted to do this, obviously I could have done this just in PowerShell and called a particular PowerShell function when something happened, like when the project was published, but I'd have to run that on a server somewhere. So I'd have to make sure that server was available, I'd have to have some way of triggering it. Even if I did it in Azure, I'd have to fire up a VM, and I'd have the VM sitting there running all the time, even though it's not doing anything. The idea of functions is that you write them, but when they're called, it instantiates the sort of environment that they're going to run in, and then it runs them, and then it shuts them down again. So the beauty of that is you're only paying when it's running. So you're probably paying for the sort of milliseconds that it's running, you're probably paying a high price, but you're not paying anything for the other 23 hours, 59 minutes, and whatever when it's not actually doing anything. So they're a great way to be able to write fairly sort of concise pieces of code that go off and do something without having to stand up a server or have some kind of platform that they're going to run on. So if we want to have a look at the code itself, this is just PowerShell. So you can run these functions in a number of different languages. You can use sort of C#, you can use Python, you can use PowerShell. And basically you have to give it everything it needs to run in that little environment. So if I look at view files, for example, what this function has got is, and the only things I've really created are the run.psi, ps1, which is the PowerShell command. It's got some sort of pre-built function stuff, and then I've loaded up the SharePoint.client.dll and the SharePoint.client.runtime.dll. And when you load them, when you just use upload and upload a file, the place it sticks them in the environment that it's going to run is basically this. So, that's the only bit I need to sort of specify, and then I put the name of the DLL afterwards. So this is really taken from a fairly standard piece of PowerShell, and it's one that Paul Mather used as an example of how to do this exact thing just using PowerShell. And then he posted something else saying this is how you do some PowerShell and use Azure Functions, and I sort of combined the two because he'd done something else in his Azure function and written some data out to SharePoint sites, but I think that's quite a compelling scenario to actually do this from a publish. So what this is doing, the top bit is really just getting the parameter, so it's making sure that when I do a post, it's getting the request body, the project ID, which is the thing I passed in. Then it's adding the SharePoint DLLs with this sort of import module command there to make sure they're available in the instance. Here I've got my PWA instance URL. I'm actually hard coding the password in this case, obviously it's serverless. I was going to look to see if there's another way of doing this in terms of passing in an app ID or something like that, or a key rather than using a username password. But I mean, for my purposes, it served okay. And then I'm converting that to a secure string and passing it in, so it doesn't actually get exposed anywhere, only to people that could actually get into here. I'm going to be making some OData calls. So basically I set up the URL that I'm going to be using for my OData call. And it's basically going into the projects and it's looking at a specific filter for project ID. And the only things I'm interested in pulling back from that are project name and project workspace internal URL, which are just two of the standard fields that are available from OData. The next thing I do is get all the data from the OData URL. So again, I'm just putting together a web request, and then I'm making the request to that OData URL, which is going in here. So all this is really doing is making that request and getting the results back. I'm actually doing a for each here, but I mean it doesn't need a for each. Basically, I sort of stole the code from Paul, and he'd use this as well, but I can understand why he's used it, because there might be other instances where you use this where your result set is more than one item. So if you do it as a for each, even if there's one there, it will work, or it'll work if there's more than one. Obviously the logic doesn't work in my case if there's more than one, but the code makes sense to sort of leave it like that. So what I'm doing here is I'm getting the project site URL from the project row that's project workspace internal URL, and then I'm getting the group name by adding the project name plus members. Because if you remember, when it creates a site, it creates the three groups, and they're project name space members, project name space owners, project space name visitors. So I'm creating my group name as being the members one, and then putting a filter in. So basically, if my project site URL contains PWA sites, then I'm going to do the rest of my code. So it's only going to do this code if my site is an external site going to PWA sites. If my site's just going to PWA, then it won't need to do any of this because it can sync the users anyway. So if it is in PWA sites, it's then going to go off and get all the team members. So again, building up some a URL here for the REST URL this time. So I'm actually going to project server rather than project data, and I'm passing in the project ID, and I'm getting back the ID of the resources. So this is basically going off and getting my resources back again. So for my team members, it's looking at for each team member in my team, it's then going off to the PWA instance URL and passing in the team member ID. So it's just really going in and adding in my particular users. So it's putting together all the web request for all of that, and then it's doing the team users here, and then finally it's doing the execute query. So it's using a sort of CSOM call to SharePoint, putting all this together and then executing the query. So it's a fairly straightforward way of taking something that sort of already works in PowerShell and just say, okay, just stand this up and run it when you need to run it in Azure. And if I go off to here, you should see. I mean, I've only run this, I don't know, 10, 12 times, something like that, for different testing and so on. But if I look and see what the cost of that was, I think it's still, last time I looked, it was like 0 or thereabouts. So let's get rid of that. Scroll down here. So I've got a storage account. I'm probably consuming a little bit in there just because the stuff's stored somewhere, but then the function itself, I haven't run it enough to even register any costs against that in terms of the compute duration or the data transfer and so on. So yeah, they're not an expensive way to do things, and certainly a lot cheaper than having a VM running that is constantly waiting and expecting to get that call coming through. So I thought it was quite a neat sort of way around this particular problem. If you do want to add the permissions to your sites and they're outside the site collection, then something like this is a fairly sort of straightforward way of coding it. So that was the Azure bit. I'll just jump back over here and just, before I go back to my slides, just jump into the blog posts that inspired me to sort of do this. I think if I come down far enough. The original blog post was this one, which I think was just using Azure Functions but wasn't really triggered by anything. So it was really just, you can write this function and then you can run the function at any time. You can run it manually from within inside the function as well. So Paul had shown how to do this, but based it on a previous blog post, which was really just using the PowerShell I've just shown you, but running it just as PowerShell. So you'd either have to run it on a periodic basis or go in and run it whenever you needed to run it and so on. So it's really putting these sort of two things together and coming up with an automated solution to do that. And then the second, or the next update to that was where Paul took that and put it into an Azure function based on an HTTP trigger. And this is where we can sort of see he's sort of set this up. Now, he used a different PowerShell in this case. His PowerShell was going off and adding a snapshot of the project to a SharePoint list. So basically, he was creating entries in a SharePoint list that would go off and say, okay, what's the current status of this particular project? Sort of how complete is it on this particular date? So quite a neat solution as well. Just going to jump back over to Azure again and take you through what some of the other capabilities of functions before I go back to the slides. Oh, to show you, I wanted to create a new function. So there, under the compute node, there's various different things down here, but one of the things is a function app. So I can give it a name, I can say what subscription it's going in. This is going in my normal Visual Studio one. I put it into a resource group, or I can use an existing one, a consumption plan, where it's going to be, all that kind of thing. And I'm not going to actually do much here, so I'm just going to assume that I'm going to use that. So I'll say create, delete this afterwards. And that's going through the deployment at the moment. If we look at here, we've got a deployment in process of this resource group. And then I'll go in and just show you some of the kinds of things we can do in there. I don't think it should take too long to do that. And one thing while that's running, actually, I could just go off and show you is just how long do these things take to run. I can see over here, we go to my resources and go to my functions and go to monitor. I can see that it took 23 seconds the last time. It seemed to be a bit variable. Normally the first time it runs, it's been about 12 or 13 seconds. In some cases it might run, and because the site isn't in PWA site collections, it might be a lot quicker. So this one was probably a project that it didn't need to touch, so it didn't do anything. But normally it's sort of 13 seconds. If it's been running recently, it might be sort of 7 or 8. So the 23 was a little bit slower than I've seen before. But basically you're only paying for, in this case, 23,651 milliseconds of time, which comes down to, as you saw, less than less than 1 cent probably. So it's a pretty sort of cheap thing to be running. You can get in and manage them in terms of using function keys, so you can say who can run them, that kind of thing. I haven't played around with this sort of integration, but you can sort of jump in and do some different things there. Actually, the stuff I was going to show you in terms of creating a new function, I can do actually in here. So this sort of shows you the range of things you can do. So you can base them on triggers from other things like Azure Queue Storage. You can base them on timers. The one I used was an HTTP trigger. In my case, I was running PowerShell. I don't know if PowerShell is actually listed here separately or whether I had to go into the... Yeah, so it uses the different sort of C#, F#, JavaScript options for most things. But you can also go in here and say, okay, well, I want to see the PowerShell ones. So I can do a timer, a queue, or a trigger based on that. But also, if you wanted to sort of write it in JavaScript or PHP or Python, then it sort of gives you the ones that you can do there as well. So I think that was all the stuff I wanted to show you in here. So I'll jump back over to my PowerPoint. So that was the demonstration. So the limitations, it's only applicable to project server permissions. The one thing I did forget to show you was that those settings aren't there if you go into a SharePoint permission site. And also there's no sync of permissions or task synchronizations out of the box. If you got that many projects, I don't know whether you'd be interested in the task synchronization anyway. I mean, you could potentially code something for task synchronization as well, but again, the fact that it is then a synchronization might be a little bit messy. I checked my code out, and if I go in and change users and publish again, it will actually rewrite the users list. I didn't see whether it probably doesn't remove ones that are already there, but it certainly adds new people that you add to the team. So if you wanted it to be a true replacement for the project one, you may want to put different people into different groups, and you may want to remove people if they're no longer on the team. So my example is just sort of a very basic throw everybody in there and just sort of it'll add the new ones in without sort of failing. But because it's sort of serverless and there's no response from it apart from the 200, so you know whether it's succeeded or not, but you don't know whether it's actually sort of done anything. You don't have any output from PowerShell. I mean, if you wanted output, you could write something into a list somewhere, but there's no sort of response coming from it. So you'd have to sort of obviously debug it beforehand to make sure that you'd coped with any potential things that might come up, like things missing or whatever. But the debug scenario is pretty good in terms of you can run the function manually and you can feed in parameters manually within the Azure UI. So you can do a sort of a good amount of testing to make sure that it's doing all the right things before you just sort of let it loose as a serverless function. Because obviously you'd want to make sure it's going to work before putting it out there, particularly as you get no real feedback as to why it failed. Permissions, and I sort of walked through this. I was going to do a separate demonstration, but it didn't seem worth sort of coming back and forth. So the potential workaround that I showed you was really you could use PowerShell to synchronize permissions. So the code I used within the function, you could just use that from your desktop and just run that when you want to set permissions on a project. But to me, it just made it a little more sort of seamless if you did that with Flow. There's another thing called Azure Logic Apps, which are basically the Azure version of Flow. They do the same kind of things and allow you to do the same kind of processes, but they're just sort of hosted in a different place. So you could either use Azure Logic Apps to call a function, or you could use Flow to call an Azure function. And the bit I did with Planner is really sort of unnecessary. You could have just gone straight from when I publish a project, run this Azure function. I only did it via Planner because I was just sort of checking to make sure what parameters I was passing over. So in fact, that's how I could see what the project type was, because I could see that 0 being put in. It's an easy way to sort of work out what it means by the various different parameters that it has. I've linked there to the 3 blog posts that Paul did. The first one is the one that just uses PowerShell. The second one is sort of the introduction to Azure Functions, and then the third one is sort of putting the PowerShell and the Azure function together, although it's a different PowerShell than the one I was I was showing you. This is quite an interesting approach. I was been looking at how you could potentially use this with planner reporting. So building up on what I did at Ready, you could potentially have an Azure function which called off and worked and got the results of perhaps counting how many not started tasks have I got, how many in progress tasks have I got, how many completed tasks have I got of particular type. So again, basing it on perhaps a category that you've got configured within Planner. And then using the approach that Paul took in his third blog there, you could write that to a SharePoint list. So you could have like a daily scheduled function that goes out and gets the information and puts it into SharePoint. So you could just scan down the list and see, okay, how are we progressing on the tasks that we've got open. So I think there's plenty of different possibilities for doing this kind of thing and making use of this kind of approach.